By the 5th century, the enormous, bustling machinery of Rome was losing its hold. Centuries of war, economic strain, and shifting climates had hollowed out the empire's infrastructure. In 476 CE, the last Western emperor was deposed, and power in much of Western Europe passed to a patchwork of new kingdoms. Roads that once linked markets and cities saw fewer carts. Sea lanes carried less trade. Town populations fell, and many urban centers shrank to a scattering of houses among ruins. For ordinary people, this change was not a single drama, but a slow, unsettling hush. Less coin in the market, fewer official orders, and the disappearance of many of the civic comforts Romans had taken for granted. At the same time, large movements of peoples, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others, reshaped borders and loyalties. Where once an imperial law might settle disputes, now local lords, warrior chiefs, and emerging kings laid down the rules. The result was a world that felt quieter and smaller. Authority shifted from city halls and imperial courts to local strongholds and rural estates. Yet in that hush, new rhythms began. Monasteries became unexpected beacons of continuity. Under leaders such as Saint Benedict in the 6th century, monastic rules organized daily life around work, prayer, and study, and monks quietly copied texts, preserved records, and kept fragments of classical learning alive through dark winters of instability. These quiet libraries would later help Europe remember and rebuild. This is not a story of total collapse, nor of simple decline. It is the first breath of a long transformation. Imagine a continent pausing, towns dim, markets thinning, and in the dim light a single candle in a scriptorium. That candle kept enough light to guide what came next. If you like this calm journey through history, subscribe and tap the bell for more slow, sleep-friendly stories from the past, one quiet chapter at a time.
Imagine a place that is small by later standards, a handful of hills beside a lazy river, yet one whose story will eventually reach across a continent. According to the tradition the Romans themselves preserved, the city begins in the mid-8th century BCE. That traditional founding date, 753 BCE, belongs more to origin story than strict archaeology. But it marks how the later Romans measured their past, a beginning that ties local families, farming communities, and rival hilltop settlements into a single remembered origin. In those early centuries, the people of Latium lived alongside other groups on the Italian peninsula. Etruscans to the north, with their wealthy cities and sophisticated metalwork, Greek settlers in the south, bringing Hellenic culture and commerce, and a host of Italic tribes spread across hills and valleys. The landscape was patchwork, small towns, fertile plains, and rocky highlands, each ruled by its own elites, and linked only loosely by trade routes and seasonal ties. The reality was local first, regional second, not yet empire. Rome's early rulers appear in the sources as a line of 7 kings, some of Etruscan origin, and some legendary in a way later Romans treated with caution. The last of these, traditionally named Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, is said to have been overthrown around 509 BCE. Ancient writers and later Roman political memory fix that year as the birth of the Republic, when power formally passed from monarchic rule to annually elected magistrates, most famously the 2 consuls. Modern historians treat the exact year and the stories surrounding it as part history, part political myth. But the shift toward new political mechanisms in the early 5th century BCE is well attested in material and textual evidence. The new Roman Republic did not transform Italy overnight. Rather, the political change set Rome on a different path. Citizens, assemblies, magistrates, and an evolving legal consciousness that would bind people together through shared procedures as much as by personal allegiance. Yet beneath the republican forms lay old pressures: land, pasture, water, and the rivalry of elite families, and new tensions between those who claimed ancestral privilege, patricians, and the broader citizenry, plebeians. These tensions would shape much of Rome's internal evolution through the coming centuries. One of the Republic's landmark moves toward public order was law made visible. In the middle of the 5th century BCE, during pressured negotiations between social groups, Rome produced a foundational legal code, the Law of the 12 Tables, traditionally dated to 451 to 450 BCE. For the first time, legal rules were no longer purely the private knowledge of magistrates. They were written, displayed, and available, a quiet revolution in predictability and public accountability. The 12 Tables addressed property, family inheritance, debt, and legal procedure, the everyday scaffolding of civic life. The Republic's outward life was one of cautious, often violent expansion across Italy. Rome's strategic advantage lay in organization. Citizen soldiers who served in legions built around service and obligation, and a network of alliances and treaties that tied peers and former enemies into an unequal but stable web. Rome rarely conquered for simple glory. It offered terms, often partial citizenship or allied status, that folded nearby communities into its orbit, while leaving many local institutions intact. This hybrid of military pressure and negotiated incorporation created a resilient, growing polity.
The Republic's century of struggle in central Italy saw Rome face a variety of opponents: Etruscan city-states to the north, Latin neighbors with whom Rome sometimes allied and sometimes fought, and the Samnites, a confederation of mountain peoples to the south and east who would test Roman stamina across decades. The Samnite Wars, generally dated 343 to 290 BCE, were not a single tide, but a series of conflicts in which Rome slowly extended control over central Italy, city by city, valley by valley. Each campaign taught new lessons about logistics, cavalry, and the need for flexible diplomacy as well as force. Those same centuries held moments of shock that echoed through Roman memory. In about 390 BCE, the Senoan Gauls, led by a chieftain called Brennus in the Roman stories, routed Roman forces at the river Allia and then entered the city itself. The sack, however briefly remembered or dramatized, seared Roman imagination and encouraged subsequent reforms and military vigilance. Roman historians used the episode to explain later fortifications and to celebrate rescuers who retook or reorganized the city. The event also highlighted how exposed a single city could be when facing a mobile, warlike opponent. Alongside military pressure, cultural and economic ties bound Italy together. Greek colonies in the south, cities like Cumae, Neapolis, and Tarentum, acted as nodes of Mediterranean exchange, bringing Hellenic pottery, sculpture, and political ideas northward. Trade routes carried oil, wine, metalwork, and finished goods. Ports and coastal settlements became places where Roman, Greek, and Etruscan merchants met. Over time, Rome absorbed not only territory, but also technologies, religious practices, and administrative techniques from neighbors. Internally, the Republic wrestled with social justice and the distribution of resources. The struggle of the orders, a long, multi-generational conflict between patricians and plebeians, produced new offices and protections for the non-elite. Institutions such as the tribune of the plebs emerged to give voice and veto to plebeians. Laws grew more public, and the Roman political system matured into a competitive, often messy, but increasingly procedural order. Those contests were not always peaceful, but they created frameworks for negotiation, public assemblies, written law, and magistrates whose power could,
at least in theory, be checked by their peers. Military innovations and practical governance often moved hand in hand. As Rome campaigned through the Italian peninsula, it learned to build roads, bridges, and supply lines, infrastructure that would later bind its territories together. The Roman practice of granting different grades of citizenship or alliance created incentives for cooperation. Allied towns provided troops, while Rome supplied strategic direction and the promise of legal privileges. This system was not equal, and resentment simmered, but it proved effective at turning a city-state into a regional power. By the early 3rd century BCE, the stage was set for Rome to look beyond the peninsula. The growing rivalry with other Mediterranean powers, above all Carthage, a maritime rival based in North Africa, with interests in Sicily and the western sea lanes, meant that Rome's expansionist logic would soon encounter a larger strategic reality. The year 264 BCE, which marks the traditional opening of the First Punic War, becomes a hinge. No longer would Rome's main wars be limited to Italian neighbors. Instead, Rome would be drawn into prolonged conflict across the sea, beginning its transformation from regional hegemon to Mediterranean power. We must be careful with dates and heroes. Roman historians like Livy wrote centuries later and mixed memory, legend, and political lessons in their accounts. Modern scholarship reads those narratives alongside archaeology, inscriptions, and comparative studies to separate kernel from embellishment. The broad contours remain robust, a people moving from scattered settlements and mutual raids to a polity that made law public, organized armies of citizens, and stitched a network of alliances across diverse communities. These were slow, cumulative changes, not a single revolution, and they explain why Rome in 264 BCE looked sturdier, more confident, and more outward-looking than the small cluster of huts beside the Tiber a half-millennium earlier. The human story in these centuries is one of adaptation. Farmers learned to plant for market as much as for family. Local elites learned to negotiate citizenship benefits. Soldiers learned to fight in formations that would carry them far beyond their home fields. The Republic's institutions, flawed, contested, and often brutally enforced, offered predictable channels for grievance and ambition. That predictability, more than any sudden conquest, is what allowed Rome to endure and to attract allies. It is the slow architecture of order that turns a collection of villages into a political power. As you imagine these centuries, smoke rising from hearths, a market day in a small Latin town, a council of elders debating a treaty, a Roman legionary tying on his caligae, notice the quiet accumulation of practices. One law made public here, one treaty agreed there, one road built between valleys. These small acts over decades produced a different kind of world. From the vantage of later history, the period between about 753 and 264 BCE reads like a long apprenticeship, Rome learning what it meant to rule, and Italy learning what it meant to be ruled. The republic that moved into the 3rd century BCE carried memories of kings and sacks, of written law and bitter social conflict, and carried with it new instruments of cohesion. What follows after 264 BCE will be a story no longer confined to a peninsula. Rome will take to the sea, confront rival empires, and test whether its systems of law, alliance, and military obligation can manage a larger world. For now, in these centuries, we can see how a continent, or at least much of it, began to seek order in the shadow of local power, shared law, and the slow, patient work of building institutions.
When the great machinery of the Western Roman Empire finally gave way in the 5th century, Europe did not collapse into an eternal darkness, nor did it suddenly become a battlefield of endless chaos. Instead, the silence that followed created a space in which new societies began to take shape, slowly, cautiously, and often without any grand proclamation. In that quiet reshaping,
dozens of emerging kingdoms began to define themselves, each with its own story, its own rhythms, and its own search for legitimacy. These early medieval realms formed not with the noise of empire-building ambition, but with the steady pace of survival, adaptation, and local governance. The first of these rising kingdoms appeared even before Rome's final days. The Visigoths, once migrating wanderers, had been settled in southwestern Gaul by imperial permission. After the sack of Rome in 410 CE and decades of movement, they established a recognized kingdom that eventually centered in what is now Spain and parts of Portugal. They inherited Roman law, Roman administrators, and Roman tax patterns, but they added their own traditions, forming a hybrid political identity. Their kings ruled from Toulouse and later from Toledo, where councils of bishops and nobles helped them craft legal codes, such as the Visigothic law, blending Roman jurisprudence with Germanic customs. In this quiet kingdom, literacy, administration, and church authority laid the groundwork for stability, long before the idea of Spain as a nation existed. North of them, in the fertile river valleys of Gaul, another kingdom gradually took shape, the Frankish realm. At first merely one among many Germanic groups living near the Roman frontier, the Franks rose under the leadership of Clovis, who reigned from 481 to 511 CE. His conversion to Christianity, influenced by his wife Clotilde and supported by the Catholic bishops of Gaul, made him a key ally of the Roman-speaking population. It also set the stage for the eventual Carolingian Empire centuries later. But in these early years, the Frankish kingdom was still a patchwork of regional identities, warriors and farmers, Latin-speaking clergy and Germanic nobility, Roman towns and rural settlements. Borders were not drawn on maps, they were understood through custom, oaths, and the influence of local lords. North of them, in the fertile river valleys of Gaul, another kingdom gradually took shape, the Frankish realm. At first merely one among many Germanic groups living near the Roman frontier, the Franks rose under the leadership of Clovis, who reigned from 481 to 511 CE. His conversion to Christianity, influenced by his wife Clotilde and supported by the Catholic bishops of Gaul, made him a key ally of the Roman-speaking population. It also set the stage for the eventual Carolingian Empire centuries later. But in these early years, the Frankish kingdom was still a patchwork of regional identities, warriors and farmers, Latin-speaking clergy and Germanic nobility, Roman towns and rural settlements. Borders were not drawn on maps, they were understood through custom, oaths, and the influence of local lords. To the east, along the upper Danube and Rhine, the Alemanni, Bavarians, and Thuringians formed their own quiet polities. These societies were far removed from the urban centers of the old empire. Their leadership structures were fluid, shaped by kinship networks rather than bureaucratic offices. Over time, these groups would fall under the Frankish orbit, but during the early medieval period, they lived in loosely connected tribal confederations. Their borders were forests, rivers, and mountains, natural frontiers that marked identity more clearly than any line on parchment. In Britain, the withdrawal of Roman authority around 410 CE left the island exposed to internal rivalries and external pressures. The Anglo-Saxons, migrating from northwestern Europe, established multiple small kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and others. Each kingdom had its own royal line, its own laws, and its own evolving culture, shaped by both pagan tradition and later Christian influence. These were not unified states, but competing regional powers, separated by swamps, forests, and linguistic divisions. Borders were not drawn on maps, they were understood through custom, oaths, and the influence of local lords. To the south, in the mountains of the Pyrenees, the Basques, ethnicity related to ancient Iberians, maintained cultural independence. Their borders were not fortified with walls or armies.
They were protected by the sharp slopes of the Pyrenees and their own strong sense of cultural continuity. In Italy, the fall of Rome did not result in a single successor state. Instead, the peninsula became a mosaic of competing powers. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, ruled much of Italy in the early 500s and attempted to preserve Roman administration even as they upheld their own Gothic traditions. After them came the Lombards, who established duchies across northern and southern Italy. Their society mixed rural warriors with surviving Roman aristocrats, generating a hybrid governance system that endured for centuries. The Byzantine Empire, from its base in Constantinople, held portions of the coast and important cities such as Ravenna, creating overlapping zones of influence. Italy's borders were therefore some of the most fluid in Europe, changing not through major conquests, but through gradual shifts in allegiance, marriage alliances, and local negotiations. Beyond the Alps, in the lands of the Slavs, new societies were also emerging during the same centuries. The Slavic migrations expanded across Eastern Europe, forming communities that would one day become kingdoms such as Poland, Bohemia, and early Slavic principalities. But in this period, their societies were still organized around clans and fortified villages rather than centralized states. Their borders were little known to Latin writers and often ignored in Western chronicles, leaving them among the forgotten borders of medieval Europe, places where identity was shaped by landscape and language rather than by monarchs or treaties. The Byzantine Empire, though the direct continuation of Rome, deserves attention here as well. Its borders, stretching across the eastern Mediterranean, were in constant flux, contracting under pressure from migrations and invasions, expanding again under the campaigns of Justinian in the mid-5th century. Byzantine Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain were reclaimed temporarily, but holding them required resources the empire could not sustain. As Byzantine authority retreated, the vacuum left behind allowed local kingdoms to rise quietly, developing their own governance structures and cultural identities.
What makes these early medieval kingdoms quiet is not their lack of conflict. Battles certainly occurred, but the manner in which identity and authority formed. There were few declarations announcing the birth of new states. Instead, authority emerged in small steps. A chief who resolved disputes, a warrior leader who protected trade routes, a bishop who organized land records, a noble family that established its dominance generation after generation. Power was negotiated in villages, courts, and small assemblies rather than in towering imperial capitals. In this world, kingship itself was often personal rather than territorial. A king was the leader of a people first and the ruler of a land only secondarily. The borders of these kingdoms were forgotten not because they failed to matter, but because they were rarely fixed in a way we would recognize today. A border could be a bend in a river, a line of ancient trees, or even a traditional understanding repeated from one generation to the next. A kingdom's domain could shrink or expand 2 days' walk, depending on which local lord felt loyal or rebellious that year. Medieval chroniclers, writing later, simplified these fluid realities, but on the ground, boundaries were living things, shifting with marriages, feuds, treaties, and seasons. Another factor that shaped the rise of quiet kingdoms was the role of the Christian Church. As the empire dissolved, bishops became stabilizing figures in many regions. Cathedrals housed not only sacred rituals, but also archives, land registers, and schools. Monasteries served as nodes of literacy and organization. Kings depended on clerics to write charters, maintain correspondence, and keep the memory of law alive. In return, the church received protection, land, and influence. This partnership was subtle but profound. It allowed kingdoms to function in ways that earlier tribal confederations could not. Through monasteries and bishoprics, ideas, texts, and practices spread between kingdoms, providing a shared cultural framework even when political borders remained uncertain. During this period, population patterns shifted toward the countryside. The great Roman cities, once centers of political life, shrank dramatically. Fewer people lived in urban areas. More lived in villages or farming estates ruled by local elites. These smaller communities shaped the character of early medieval kingdoms. Without large urban hubs, administration became localized. Kings relied heavily on local nobles, who controlled land and justice. In many cases, these nobles held real power, while kings acted as symbolic leaders or as judges in major disputes. This decentralized world produced many forgotten borders, boundaries of estates, forests, and valleys that defined daily life more than any royal decree. Yet despite fragmentation, this era was not static. Trade routes persisted. The Mediterranean remained a corridor of commerce, and Northern Europe began to develop its own economic networks along rivers such as the Rhine and Danube. These exchanges allowed kingdoms to acquire wealth, goods, and new ideas. Over time, economic contact encouraged diplomatic contact, and diplomatic contact encouraged the formalization of borders. Treaties were written, marriages arranged, and alliances forged. Slowly, quietly, the early medieval kingdoms began to stabilize. By the late 6th and 7th centuries, the political landscape of Europe looked entirely different from the one Rome had left behind. The Visigoths ruled most of Iberia. The Franks dominated Gaul. The Lombards controlled large parts of Italy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms shaped Britain's identity. The Slavs expanded in the east, and the Byzantine Empire held a precarious but culturally rich line along the Mediterranean. These were not temporary enclaves. They were the foundations of medieval Europe's political map. What is striking about these kingdoms is not their military prowess, but their resilience. They survived without the massive armies, bureaucracy, or financial systems that had sustained Rome. They endured through local loyalty, practical leadership, and adaptation to the land. Their rulers understood that governing meant negotiating with powerful local families and protecting the resources that sustained communities. Borders mattered only when they affected people's lives, and so kingdoms expanded toward areas where they could realistically maintain influence. The forgotten borders of early medieval Europe, forests, rivers, mountain passes, and linguistic frontiers, tell us much about how communities define themselves. Political borders were fluid, but cultural borders were persistent. A valley of Latin-speaking farmers might be separated from a hill tribe by only a short distance, yet they lived in different worlds. A Frankish settlement might sit near a Burgundian village, but marriages, customs, and loyalties kept identities distinct. These divisions, invisible on modern maps, shaped medieval Europe as deeply as any kingdom. Over the centuries, many of these quiet kingdoms would merge, split, or transform. The Carolingians would rise from the Frankish elite. The Umayyads would reshape Iberia. The papacy would become a political actor in Italy. But the foundations laid in the 5th to 7th centuries remained vital. They established patterns of governance, culture, and identity that endured for a millennium. And so, as we look back on this period, we see not a Europe lost in darkness, but one quietly reinventing itself. The noise of empire was replaced by the calm, steady work of communities building new forms of life. In the silence that followed Rome's fall, the early medieval kingdoms took root, small, fragile, and often overlooked, yet destined to shape the future of an entire continent.
When the great institutions of the Western Roman world faded, something unexpected rose quietly in their place. Cities shrank, trade slowed, roads decayed, and the once vast bureaucracy that had organized millions of lives disappeared. Yet in this long twilight, a different kind of institution stepped forward,
one built not on armies or taxes, but on silence, discipline, faith, and an unwavering dedication to learning. These were the medieval monasteries, places that would become the silent keepers of knowledge. Without fanfare or glory, they preserved the memory of a world that might otherwise have been forgotten. A monastery was more than a religious retreat. It was a self-contained world, designed to sustain life, study, and worship, even when political borders shifted and kingdoms rose or fell. The earliest Western monastic practices emerged in the deserts of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Hermits, seeking spiritual purity, withdrew from society to live in solitude, but their example attracted others. Soon, clusters of huts, simple chapels, and communal rule books formed the earliest monasteries. The idea spread westward, reaching Italy, Gaul, and eventually the edges of the Atlantic world. The turning point came with Saint Benedict of Nursia, a Roman-born monk who lived between the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Around 529 CE, he founded the monastery of Monte Cassino in central Italy. There he composed a text that would shape Western monastic life for centuries, the Rule of Saint Benedict. It was a simple, balanced guide, neither too harsh nor too lenient. It required monks to pray at regular hours, to work, to study, and to obey their abbot. In a world filled with unpredictability, Benedict offered structure. His rule created stability, and this stability became the foundation upon which knowledge could be preserved. Monasteries spread rapidly across Europe. By the 7th and 8th centuries, they dotted the landscapes of Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and the British Isles. Some lay near towns, others rose in remote valleys or on windswept islands. The Irish monasteries in particular became centers of extraordinary creativity. Cut off from much of continental turmoil, Ireland developed a distinct monastic culture known for its devotion to learning, art, and missionary activity. Places like Clonmacnoise, Kells, and Iona became storehouses of scripture, classical texts, and early medieval scholarship. Inside a medieval monastery, life moved according to a rhythm almost untouched by outside events. The day began before sunrise with prayer. Then came reading, copying texts, tending fields, caring for animals, teaching novices, or working in the scriptorium, rooms dedicated solely to writing. Meals were simple, often silent. Evenings ended with more prayer. The hours were marked by bells, not by market noise or civic meetings. In this structured world, monks could devote themselves to detailed, patient tasks that no government or kingdom of the time could support. Chief among these tasks was the preservation of texts. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, letter by letter, with a precision born from discipline. In the early medieval period, books were precious objects, made of parchment or vellum, stitched carefully, and written with inks prepared in the monastery itself. Some manuscript took years to complete. Others were collections of copied fragments, preserving bits of Roman poetry, Greek philosophy, biblical commentary, medical treatises, and historical chronicles. Many of the works of antiquity that survive today exist only because a monk somewhere in Europe between the 6th and 12th centuries decided to copy them. Without the monasteries, we would know little of Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, Pliny, Tacitus, or early Christian thinkers like Augustine and Jerome. The monasteries did not save everything, many works were lost, but they saved enough to keep the intellectual tradition alive. In the British Isles, the work of copying took on an artistic dimension unmatched elsewhere. The Irish and Northumbrian monasteries produced illuminated manuscripts, books adorned with intricate knots, swirling patterns, and vivid pigments. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Durrow are among the most famous examples. These manuscripts were not merely religious texts, they were masterpieces of visual culture. Their creation required steady hands, trained eyes, and years of quiet concentration. In their colors and interlaced designs, we see a world that valued beauty as deeply as devotion. Beyond copying texts, monasteries preserved knowledge through organization. Many kept detailed annals or chronicles, recording events year by year: floods, eclipses, royal successions, battles, harvest yields, and unusual weather. These records, often written in concise Latin, now serve as some of the most valuable sources for early medieval history. They reveal how societies viewed time, memory, and the unfolding of their world. Without these monastic annals, vast stretches of European history would remain blank. Monasteries also served children of the nobility. Many young boys were sent to monasteries for education, even if they did not plan to become monks. They learned Latin, arithmetic, scripture, and basic writing, skills few outside the church possessed. In some monasteries, even sons of peasants could study if they showed promise. Thus, monasteries became quiet engines of literacy and learning, gradually shaping the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe. One of the most significant contributions of monasteries came through the work of scholars such as Bede, an English monk from Northumbria. Living in the 7th and 8th centuries, Bede wrote historical works, biblical commentaries, treatises on timekeeping, and explanations of the natural world. His most famous book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, remains a crucial source for early English history. Bede represents the highest ideal of monastic scholarship: disciplined, thoughtful, and grounded in both faith and reason. Meanwhile, on the European continent, the Carolingian rulers, especially Charlemagne, recognized the value of monastic learning. In the late 8th and early 9th centuries, Charlemagne initiated what scholars now call the Carolingian Renaissance. This was not a renaissance in the later sense of large-scale intellectual transformation, but it was a significant revival of literacy, script reform, and administrative knowledge. Charlemagne invited scholars like Alcuin of York to his court, supported monastic schools, and encouraged uniform handwriting. The result was the Carolingian minuscule, a clean and readable script that became the basis for modern lowercase letters. Without this monastic-driven script reform, medieval texts would be far harder to read, and many might not have survived at all.
Perhaps the least visible but most important contribution was the preservation of Latin as a scholarly and administrative language. As spoken Latin evolved into regional dialects, early French, Spanish, Italian, and others, the written form remained stable in monasteries. This created a continuity of communication across Europe. A monk in Ireland could read a letter from Italy. A scholar in Germany could study the works of a Spanish bishop. Latin became the thread that connected different kingdoms, cultures, and intellectual traditions. Without monastic literacy, Europe's linguistic landscape might have fractured completely. The physical structure of monasteries also helped preserve knowledge. Their thick stone walls, isolated locations, and stable routines provided protection from the political turbulence outside. Even when wars passed through, monastic libraries were sometimes spared because they were viewed as sacred. Kings relied on monasteries for record-keeping, coronation ceremonies, and spiritual legitimacy, giving them a degree of protection that few secular institutions enjoyed. Yet monasteries were not isolated from the world. They managed large estates, employed laborers, paid taxes, advised kings, and interacted with merchants. Their economic strength often made them targets of envy, but it also funded their scribes, libraries, and schools. A wealthy monastery might support dozens of monks, a poor one only a few. The size of the library often reflected the wealth of the community. Some monasteries preserved hundreds of manuscripts, others just a handful. But even a single copied text could alter the future of knowledge. As centuries passed, monastic networks expanded. Monks traveled between houses, sharing manuscripts, ideas, and reforms. The Cluniac movement, beginning in the early 10th century, emphasized strict adherence to Benedictine rule, elaborate liturgy, and scholarly pursuits. Later, the Cistercians promoted simplicity and contemplation while still maintaining scriptoria in many of their houses. These movements ensured that the monastic tradition did not stagnate. Each wave brought renewal, new disciplines, and new intellectual energy. By the 12th century, Europe was changing. Towns grew. Trade revived. Universities appeared. The new centers of learning in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and elsewhere began to take over some of the scholarly roles once held mainly by monasteries. But the universities themselves depended on monastic manuscripts. Students and teachers read Benedict, Augustine, Boethius, Aristotle, and countless other writers because monks had copied their works faithfully for centuries. The monasteries, then, were not relics. They were bridges between antiquity and the medieval world, between learning and faith, between past and future. Their contribution cannot be measured simply by the number of books they copied. It lies in the fact that they made learning a regular part of daily life at a time when the wider world could not support such work. They gave Europe something it desperately needed: continuity. Imagine for a moment a quiet scriptorium in the 9th century. A single window lets in pale light. A monk sits at a wooden desk, his quill moving slowly across a sheet of parchment. Around him lie other manuscripts, some tattered, some freshly stitched. He pauses occasionally to sharpen his pen or whisper a prayer. Hours pass in near silence. Outside, political alliances shift, kingdoms rise and fall, and armies march. But inside this room, a different battle is fought, against forgetfulness, against the erosion of memory. Each mark of ink becomes an act of preservation. It is easy to overlook the significance of this labor. The monks did not know that centuries later their work would be studied in universities or displayed in museums. They copied texts because the rule told them to, because they believed in the value of learning, and because their community depended on written knowledge. They never imagined that they were shaping the intellectual future of the Western world. Yet they were. Without monasteries, the foundations of medieval scholarship would have crumbled. Without their records, we would know little of early medieval Europe. Without their scripts, our writing might look entirely different. Without their libraries, the Renaissance would have lacked the texts it needed to flourish. In the long sweep of history, monasteries stand as some of the most remarkable institutions ever created, not because they were powerful, but because they were patient. In a world of noise, they chose silence. In a time of uncertainty, they chose order. In an age when much was lost, they chose to preserve.
When people today imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture armored knights on horseback, towering stone castles, and villages clustered around peaceful fields. And while these images are not entirely wrong, The true medieval world was quieter, more measured, and far more deeply structured by everyday rhythms than the grand dramas we see in films. The lives of knights, the construction of castles, and the routines of peasants and townspeople were woven into an interconnected pattern, one that moved with the pace of seasons, rituals, obligations, and centuries of tradition. To understand the knights of medieval Europe, we must first understand the society that created them. Knights were not simply warriors, they were the products of a long evolution of military practice and social structure. In the early Middle Ages, mounted warriors existed across Europe, but they were not yet the chivalric figures we later associate with the medieval world. They were part of the local warrior elite, men who had land, influence, and the resources to maintain horses and weapons. Over time, as Europe stabilized under feudal structures and larger kingdoms developed clearer hierarchies, these mounted warriors became a distinct class. Their training, responsibilities, and codes began to take shape. The path to knighthood usually began in childhood. A young boy of noble birth might be sent at the age of 7 to live in the household of a lord. There he would serve as a page, learning the basic expectations of noble life: courtesy, discipline, literacy, and religious instruction. At around 14, he could become a squire, an apprentice who learned to ride, manage equipment, and accompany his lord in training and sometimes in battle. If he proved worthy, he might be knighted in his early 20s. The ceremony varied from region to region, but it often involved prayers, oaths, and the symbolic dubbing that marked him as a full member of the knightly order. But knighthood was more than ceremony. It was responsibility. A knight was expected to defend the lands of his lord, uphold justice within his domain, and protect those under his charge. He maintained armor, often chainmail in the early Middle Ages, later plate armor, and weapons such as swords, lances, and shields. These objects required constant upkeep and significant expense. Knights needed horses, stable workers, and a retinue of attendants. The wealth required to maintain this lifestyle meant that knights were closely tied to the landholding class. They were not free-roaming heroes, they were administrators, land managers, and local leaders. Alongside these knights stood the castles, centers of power, defense, and administration. Early medieval fortifications were often wooden, built quickly atop earthen mounds known as mottes. These motte and bailey structures were effective in times of instability, but they were not built to last. By the 11th and 12th centuries, as European kingdoms grew stronger, stone castles became increasingly common. These castles were feats of engineering, thick walls, narrow stairwells, and high towers that allowed defenders to survey the surrounding countryside. A castle's purpose was not simply to withstand attack, but to project authority. It served as a residence for the lord, a storage place for grain and tools, a refuge for villagers during emergencies, and a hub of local justice. Inside a castle, life followed a predictable rhythm. The lord and lady oversaw the management of the estate, collecting rents, settling disputes, organizing agricultural work, and planning for the year ahead. There were servants responsible for cooking, cleaning, tending animals, and maintaining the castle's defenses. Knights and men-at-arms trained in the courtyard, caring for their weapons and practicing skills they might seldom use in real battle. Most days passed without conflict. In fact, despite the dramatic images of medieval warfare, the vast majority of knights spent far more time in administration and training than in combat. Surrounding the castle were the village fields, open lands divided into long strips worked by peasants. These peasants, or serfs in many regions, lived in simple wooden houses with thatched roofs. Their lives were structured by the agricultural calendar, plowing in the spring, sowing in early summer, harvesting in late summer and autumn, and repairing tools during the winter. This rhythm was almost timeless, older than the medieval period itself. But in the Middle Ages, it took on a new dimension because of the feudal system. Feudalism, though often oversimplified, was essentially a web of mutual obligations. A lord granted land to vassals, often knights, in exchange for service. Peasants worked the land and provided food, rents, and labor in exchange for protection. This system, though uneven, ensured a kind of stability. Each man and woman knew their place within the hierarchy, and society moved with a slow, predictable pace. Year after year, the same tasks repeated: tending animals, repairing fences, preparing fields, spinning wool, brewing ale, and celebrating religious feast days. Religion played a central role in shaping the calm rhythm of medieval life. Churches stood at the heart of villages and towns, marking the passing of time with bells that called people to prayer. The calendar revolved around feast days, saint celebrations, harvest festivals, and fasting periods. These religious observances provided structure and moments of rest, breaking up the agricultural cycle with communal gatherings. Even the smallest village lived in rhythm with the church. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, and weekly services define the milestones of life.
In many respects, life in medieval villages was peaceful, not because it lacked hardship, but because people accepted the constraints of their world as natural. Most individuals never traveled far from the place where they were born. Their knowledge of the wider world came from traveling merchants, clerics, or news carried by soldiers. Yet this limited mobility also created tightly knit communities. Families worked together, shared tools, helped each other during harvest, and supported one another through illness or shortages. The medieval village was not merely a place of work, it was a community bound by necessity, tradition, and shared belief. Within this structure, knights were both admired and feared. They represented authority, skill, and military power, but their presence also reminded villagers of the realities of obligation. Knights collected rents, enforced the lord's decisions, and oversaw legal disputes. They were central figures in maintaining order, and their reputation rested on their conduct. Over time, the idea of chivalry emerged, a moral code emphasizing bravery, loyalty, courtesy, and the protection of the weak. This code was idealized more in literature than reality, but it had genuine influence. Knights were expected to behave honorably, though not all lived up to the ideal. As centuries passed, tournaments became a major part of knightly culture. These events were not merely entertainment, they were training exercises shaped by ritual and prestige. Knights competed in jousts, melees, and skill challenges, demonstrating their abilities before nobles and commoners alike. Tournaments helped build networks of alliance and reputation, but they also reinforced the idea that knighthood was more than warfare. It was a performance of social order, a ritual display of discipline, courage, and nobility. Meanwhile, inside the castle walls, domestic life continued at its own steady pace. The lady of the castle was often responsible for overseeing household affairs, managing food stores, supervising servants, and maintaining the estate's finances. She also had a role in diplomacy, hosting guests, arranging marriages, and strengthening alliances. Many noblewomen were literate, skilled in managing correspondence and estate accounts. Their contributions, though often overlooked in later storytelling, were essential to the functioning of medieval society. Life within a castle could be surprisingly comfortable for its time. Large halls were heated by central hearths. Meals were taken communally. Music and storytelling provided entertainment, and tapestries helped insulate the cold stone walls. Yet castles were also practical spaces.
Storerooms held grain, weapons, and tools. Towers provided lookout points, and thick walls offered protection. In the event of siege or war, villagers could seek refuge behind these walls, relying on the castle as the final line of defense. Still, it is important to remember that warfare, while not constant, did shape medieval society. Knights trained because conflict was always a possibility. Castles were built because threats were real, whether from rival lords, external invaders, or raiding forces. But even in times of conflict, life returned quickly to its quiet rhythms once battles ended. The majority of the population continued to farm, trade, pray, marry, and raise children. Their lives were not defined by war, but by work and community. Trade and craft work also enriched medieval life. Blacksmiths forged tools and horseshoes. Carpenters built houses and wagons. Weavers produced cloth. Millers ground grain into flour. Markets formed in towns and growing urban centers, where merchants exchanged goods like salt, wool, wine, and metalwork. These interactions introduced new ideas and connected rural villages to wider networks. Even knights relied on these craftsmen, for their weapons, armor, and equipment required skilled hands to maintain. As the High Middle Ages approached, the period between the 11th and 13th centuries, Europe experienced growth. Population increased, towns expanded, and new innovations emerged. Improved plows, crop rotation, and new milling technologies increased agricultural productivity. With more food came more stability. This in turn supported larger castles, better equipped knights, and more specialized crafts. Yet despite these changes, the fundamental rhythms of life remained steady. Seasons still dictated labor, feast days still structured time, and obligations still defined relationships. By the late medieval period, the role of knights began to shift. As professional armies developed, as new weapons emerged, and as kings centralized power, knights became less central to warfare. Yet their symbolic importance grew, immortalized in literature, poetry, and legend. Castles, too, changed. Many became more refined residences rather than pure fortresses. But the cultural patterns created in earlier centuries persisted. The medieval world had been built on these quiet rhythms, and even as history moved forward, their influence lingered. Looking back, we see a world neither dark nor chaotic, but deeply ordered. Knights, castles, and peasants were not isolated figures. They formed a single ecosystem. Each depended on the others. The knight needed the peasant's labor to support his training. The peasant needed the knight's protection to maintain stability. The castle stood as a symbol of this mutual dependency, a place of security, governance, and community. Together, they created a slow, steady cadence that made medieval Europe surprisingly resilient. And so the calm rhythm of medieval life emerges not from a lack of activity, but from a balance between duty, tradition, and community. The world of knights and castles was alive with motion. Horses galloping in the courtyard, hammers ringing on anvils, bells marking the hours of prayer, and farmers tending fields beneath the open sky. Yet beneath all this was a profound sense of continuity. Days followed familiar patterns. Seasons brought predictable tasks. Lives moved through established stages. In a time often imagined as turbulent, most people experienced constancy. When we imagine the Middle Ages now, it is easy to be distracted by the dramatic, sieges, throne struggles, and heroic battles. But the deeper truth lies in the quiet moments. Children playing near the castle gate, monks chanting in distant chapels,
knights tending their horses at dusk, and families gathering around fires. These are the sounds of a world held together not by chaos, but by a shared rhythm. And in that rhythm, medieval Europe found its identity.
When the Western Roman Empire dissolved, Europe became a mosaic of kingdoms, tribes, and communities, searching for meaning and stability. Political borders shifted constantly, languages divided regions, and local customs varied wildly. Yet across this fragmented world, one force slowly wove a common cultural thread. A faith that had once been a persecuted minority, but was now rising as a unifying religion. Christianity, deeply rooted in the late Roman world, began to spread across the continent in quiet, persistent waves. It moved not only through kings and warriors, but through monks, missionaries, and ordinary believers. Over centuries, it transformed a divided continent into a shared spiritual landscape. To understand this transformation, we must begin with the world immediately after Rome. Christianity had already become dominant in the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, and it remained a strong presence in many parts of the West. But when political authority crumbled, Christian communities faced challenges: devastated towns, unstable leadership, and local rulers who followed a mixture of old Roman practices and Germanic traditions. In this environment, faith became both a stabilizing force and a bridge between cultures. The bishops played a crucial role in this transition. As civic institutions broke down, bishops often stepped into roles previously managed by Roman officials. They oversaw charity, mediated disputes, and maintained public order. Cities such as Rome, Milan, Lyon, and Arles had bishops whose authority extended beyond the spiritual realm. Their influence made Christianity a practical force, reliable, organized, and comforting in uncertain times. The church was not simply a set of beliefs, it was an institution capable of preserving continuity. Yet the spread of faith across the continent did not happen uniformly. Different regions embraced Christianity in different ways, often shaped by local politics. In the lands of the Franks, everything changed with the rise of Clovis I. His conversion to Christianity around 496 CE, influenced by Queen Clotilde and the Catholic bishops of Gaul, marked a turning point. Unlike many other Germanic rulers who followed Arian Christianity, a theological branch differing from the teachings of Rome, Clovis embraced the Catholic faith. This decision aligned his kingdom with the Roman Church, giving him the support of local clergy and Romanized elites. As the Frankish kingdom expanded, so did its religious influence. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths initially followed Arian Christianity, creating tension with the Catholic majority. But in 587 CE, King Recared I converted to Catholicism. His conversion, confirmed by the Third Council of Toledo, unified faith under a single doctrine and strengthened the kingdom's cohesion. Churches flourished, councils met regularly, and clergy became key advisors to the crown. The Visigothic kingdom became a vibrant center of Christian learning and law, producing legal codes and theological works that influenced later generations. In Italy, the collapse of Roman authority created overlapping spheres of influence. The Ostrogoths, Lombards, and the Byzantine Empire each controlled different regions. The Lombards, who arrived in the late 6th century, were initially Arians. Over time, however, they converted to Catholicism, influenced by queens like Theodelinda and the persuasive power of bishops in cities such as Milan and Rome. Slowly, the Lombard kingdom joined the Catholic world. Monasteries in Italy, Monte Cassino being the most famous, helped spread religious practices, educate clergy, and preserve ancient texts. These institutions became spiritual lighthouses in a divided land. England's story was even more complex. After the Roman withdrawal, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms such as Northumbria, Wessex, and Mercia were largely pagan. The conversion began in 597 CE with Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great. Augustine landed in Kent and converted King Ethelbert, establishing the first Roman mission in the Anglo-Saxon world. But Christianity also arrived from another direction, from Ireland. Irish monasticism had grown independently of Rome's direct control. The Irish Church, shaped by figures like St. Patrick, Columba, and Bridget of Kildare, developed strong scholarly and missionary traditions. Missionaries from the Irish monastery of Iona traveled to northern Britain, converting the Picts and founding monasteries across Scotland and northern England. The meeting of the Roman and Irish mission traditions created tension, but the Synod of Whitby in 664 CE aligned England with Roman customs. From that point on, English Christianity grew rapidly, supported by monasteries, bishops, and royal patronage. In the vast territories of the Slavs, Avars, and later the Magyars, the spread of Christianity unfolded over centuries. Slavic migrations in the 6th and 7th centuries created new communities across Eastern Europe, communities that had their own traditions and spiritual beliefs. It was not until the 9th century that major conversions began, often linked to diplomacy and political alliances. The most famous example is the mission of Cyril and Methodius, two Byzantine brothers who created the Glagolitic alphabet, the ancestor of the Cyrillic script. Their mission to Moravia brought Christianity in a form that respected local language and culture. Their work laid the foundation for the Christianization of Slavic regions such as Bulgaria, Serbia, and later Kiev and Rus. The Carolingian Empire, under Charlemagne, played a significant role in spreading Christianity across Western and Central Europe. Charlemagne saw Christianity as a force for both spiritual unity and political stability. He supported missionary activity among the Saxons, Bavarians, and other Germanic peoples. Some conversions were peaceful. Others were tied to military campaigns. Yet once regions were integrated, monasteries, schools, and churches followed. The Carolingian reforms standardized liturgy, improved clergy education, and strengthened ties with Rome. Under Charlemagne and his successors, Christianity became deeply woven into the cultural fabric of Central Europe.
In Scandinavia, the pagan world of Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and others, gradually gave way to Christianity between the 9th and 12th centuries. Early contact came through trade and diplomacy. Scandinavian kings recognized the political advantages of aligning with Christian Europe. Missionaries from England and Germany brought the faith northward, but conversion required patience. Eventually, kings such as Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, and Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden adopted Christianity. Their baptism did not immediately transform society, but over time, churches, diocese networks, and monastic houses spread. By the end of the medieval period, Scandinavia was firmly part of Christian Europe. Christianity's spread was not only political, it was cultural. Churches became centers of literacy. Monasteries produced manuscripts and educated clergy. Cathedrals reshaped urban landscapes, symbolizing faith's presence through towering stone structures. Pilgrimages connected people across distances. Shrines such as Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, and Rome in Italy brought together travelers of different backgrounds. Through shared rituals and journeys, people from distant regions found common identity. Yet even as Christianity united Europe, the continent remained diverse. Local customs blended with Christian practices. Regional saints developed. Folk traditions persisted. In some places, older beliefs were incorporated into new religious forms. For instance, sacred springs, groves, and festivals were sometimes given Christian meanings rather than destroyed. This blending was not deception, it was adaptation. The Church understood that faith grew stronger when it respected local rhythms. The clergy played essential roles in maintaining unity across diverse regions. Priests baptized children, blessed marriages, comforted the sick, and led funerals. Monks prayed, educated, and copied texts. Bishops oversaw dioceses, managed land, advised kings, and resolved disputes. Their influence extended into law, economics, diplomacy, and community life. In many rural areas, the local priest was the sole literate person, making him the keeper of knowledge, memory, and stability.
Cathedrals, built over centuries, became symbols of this cultural transformation. These massive structures, Paris's Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, were not merely buildings. They were community projects involving thousands of workers and generations of effort. Their stained glass windows taught biblical stories to those who could not read. Their bells marked the passing of time. Their altars hosted festivals that brought entire towns together. Through these spaces, faith shaped daily life in ways both grand and intimate. Christianity's spread also encouraged the growth of law, diplomacy, and education. Canon law, the Church's legal system, provided procedures for marriage, inheritance, and moral disputes. Monasteries and cathedral schools trained clergy, many of whom became royal advisors. The preservation of Latin allowed communication across borders. In this way, Christianity did not merely convert hearts, it created intellectual structures that supported governance and learning. Yet Christianity was not a uniform force. The eastern and western halves of the Church developed differences that eventually led to the Great Schism of 1054, dividing Christianity into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. This separation influenced politics, culture, and religious identity for centuries. Still, despite the schism, both traditions contributed to the shaping of Europe. The Orthodox world influenced Russia, the Balkans, and parts of Eastern Europe. The Catholic world shaped Western and Central Europe. Their shared roots ensured that, even when divided, Christianity remained a common cultural foundation. By the end of the medieval period, the continent had been transformed. Regions that once followed dozens of local gods now shared a common faith. Kingdoms that had once fought as strangers now recognized each other through shared rituals. The Church had become one of the most influential institutions in Europe, guiding moral life, preserving knowledge, and connecting communities across vast distances. But the true power of Christianity's spread lay not in its political reach, but in its quiet influence on everyday life. It shaped how people saw the world, the meaning of time, the purpose of life, the hope of salvation, and the value of community. It provided comfort during famine, illness, war, and uncertainty. It offered explanations for natural events, frameworks for justice, and rituals for every stage of life. A divided continent, marked by shifting borders and diverse cultures, found unity through shared belief. The spread of faith was not a sudden revolution. It was a slow, steady current that moved through villages, courts, monasteries, markets, and households. It traveled with missionaries crossing mountains, with merchants sailing rivers, with kings forging alliances, and with monks carrying books across wilderness frontiers. And so, as we look back at the Middle Ages, we find that the unity of Europe was not built by armies or empires, but by communities of believers living simple lives, praying in wooden churches, gathering for feast days, teaching children, lighting candles at dusk, and carrying faith from one generation to the next. Through their quiet devotion, Christianity became the thread that stitched a divided continent into a shared civilization.
When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the vast network of roads, markets, and maritime lanes that had once connected Europe to Africa and Asia began to fall silent. Trade did not vanish completely, but it shrank, narrowed, and became less predictable. Once busy ports lost their fleets, merchants retreated to safer regions, and the long-distance exchanges that had tied civilizations together grew rare. Yet even in this period of contraction, the logic of human need, salt, grain, cloth, metal, spices, and stories remained. Over centuries, through careful negotiation and quiet perseverance, new trade routes slowly emerged, reconnecting regions that had drifted apart. These routes would reshape the medieval world and form the backbone of global exchange. To understand this long rebirth, imagine Europe in the early Middle Ages. Roads built by Rome still existed, but many were cracked or overgrown.
River traffic had thinned. Coastal trade was vulnerable to piracy and regional conflicts. Large marketplaces survived mostly in former Roman cities, but their reach was limited. Local economies dominated, with peasants producing for nearby communities rather than distant buyers. Yet beneath this localism, merchants never stopped moving. Small caravans crossed mountain passes. Fishermen traded along shorelines. Traveling peddlers visited villages, carrying news and goods. These modest movements laid the groundwork for the revival to come. One of the earliest centers to regain commercial vitality was the Mediterranean, a sea that had carried goods for millennia. Even during periods of turmoil, ships from the Byzantine Empire continued to travel between Constantinople, Egypt, Syria, and the Aegean Islands. They transported silk, spices, olive oil, wine, and pottery. These routes preserved a link between Eastern and Western traditions. Meanwhile, Italian coastal towns, Amalfi, Naples, Venice, and Genoa, began to rebuild maritime networks. Their strategic locations allowed them to trade not only with Byzantium, but also with North Africa and the Islamic world. Over time, these towns became maritime republics, relying on fleets of well-designed ships to restore Mediterranean commerce. Beyond the sea, the Carolingian Empire played a role in reactivating inland trade. Under Charlemagne and his successors, markets were regulated, weights and measures standardized, and certain trade privileges granted. He encouraged long-distance merchants, known as negociatores, to travel across imperial lands. The Rhine and Danube rivers became major arteries for moving goods, connecting towns in modern-day France, Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Although these networks were smaller than Rome's, they revived the idea that regions could prosper through exchange rather than isolation. One of the quiet successes of early medieval trade was the rise of river routes. Rivers had always been natural highways, but in the Middle Ages, they became essential to economic recovery. The Seine, Loire, Rhine, Elbe, and Po linked inland settlements to coastal ports. Boats carried grain, timber, wool, salt, honey, and furs. River barges moved slowly but reliably, connecting growing towns. Many medieval cities, including Paris, Cologne, and Venice, built their fortunes on control of river traffic. Docks, warehouses, and toll stations sprang up, turning riverside communities into bustling commercial hubs. Meanwhile, far to the north, the Vikings played a surprising role in reconnecting Europe with the wider world. Known for raiding, they were also highly skilled traders. From Scandinavia, they sailed along the Baltic and North Seas, reaching as far as Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. But their greatest impact lay along the river systems of Eastern Europe. Viking merchants established trade stations along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, linking the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They traded furs, amber, honey, and slaves for silver, silk, and luxury goods from the Islamic world and Byzantium. Their routes formed part of an emerging network that would later become essential to the economies of Kievan Rus and Northern Europe. At the same time, the Islamic world developed one of the most sophisticated commercial networks of the Middle Ages. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century, Muslim merchants spread across North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and into Central Asia. They traveled with caravans across the Sahara, sailed the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and reached as far as India, China, and East Africa. Because Islam emphasized fair trading, written contracts, and stable markets, merchants operated with confidence. Goods like spices, textiles, ivory, gold, books, and ceramics flowed through cities like Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba. Europe benefited indirectly. Mediterranean ports became gateways through which Islamic products reached Christian towns. Another significant revival came through the Silk Road, not as a centralized route, but as a constellation of paths linking East Asia to the Middle East and Europe. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea traveled westward through Central Asian markets, sometimes passing through Persian caravans before reaching Mediterranean merchants. Although Europe's direct participation in the Silk Road was limited compared to Asia, its influence was profound. The flow of goods encouraged curiosity about distant lands, inspired travel accounts, and fostered the idea that the world was interconnected. The Byzantine Empire, positioned between Europe and Asia, served as a crucial intermediary. Constantinople, one of the most vibrant cities of the Middle Ages, controlled access to the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Its markets were filled with goods from every direction. Byzantine coins circulated widely, providing a stable medium for transactions. Diplomatic missions traveled east to Turkic and Arab lands and west to Frankish courts. Despite political fluctuations, Byzantium remained a commercial bridge until its fall centuries later. In Western Europe, the 9th and 10th centuries were still challenging. Viking raids, internal conflicts, and economic instability disrupted trade. But by the 11th century, Europe began to experience sustained growth. Population increased, agriculture improved, and towns expanded. With more surplus food and a need for manufactured goods, trade routes grew busier. Towns that had once been small fortified settlements blossomed into thriving centers with markets, guilds, and specialized crafts.
During this period, the Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, rose to dominance. Their ships traveled across the Mediterranean, carrying wool from England, timber from the Balkans, glass from Italy, and spices from the East. Venice, in particular, specialized in maintaining relationships with the Byzantine Empire and Islamic states, negotiating trade privileges that allowed it to grow wealthy. Genoa competed fiercely, establishing colonies and warehouses in strategic ports. These republics did not merely transport goods, they built networks that linked Europe to Asia and Africa through commercial alliances. At the same time, in Northern Europe, a new trade network flourished, the Hanseatic League. Centered around the Baltic and North Sea, this association of merchant towns, such as Lübeck, Hamburg, Gdansk, Riga, and Bruges, coordinated shipping, negotiated with kings, and enforced commercial standards. The Hanseatic League transported goods such as timber, furs, grain, fish, and metals. Their ships, the sturdy cogs, sailed regularly between ports, ensuring reliable supply chains. By the 14th century, the League had become one of the most powerful economic forces in Europe, demonstrating how cooperation could overcome regional fragmentation. As these networks grew, market towns and fairs became vital meeting points for merchants. Some fairs lasted for weeks, drawing buyers from distant regions. The Champagne fairs in France were especially famous. Located at a crossroads between northern and southern Europe, these fairs allowed merchants from Italy, France, England, Flanders, and Germany to exchange cloth, spices, wines, metals, and luxury goods. Contracts were written, credit extended, and information shared. These gatherings helped create a commercial culture built on trust and shared practices. Trade also stimulated new financial innovations. As merchants traveled farther, carrying large amounts of coin became dangerous. To solve this, Italian bankers developed instruments such as letters of credit, bills of exchange, and deposit accounts. These innovations allowed merchants to travel without carrying heavy money. They also laid the foundation for modern banking. Venice and Florence, in particular, became financial centers whose influence shaped European commerce for centuries. Beyond material goods, ideas traveled along trade routes as well. Scientific texts from the Islamic world reached Europe, influencing medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought knowledge of new crops, spices, and technologies. Meanwhile, travelers such as Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, and Benjamin of Tudela
left detailed reports describing cultures far beyond Europe's borders. These accounts expanded medieval understanding of geography, economics, and global diversity. By the later Middle Ages, the world was more connected than at any time since antiquity. A merchant could travel from London to Venice, hire passage to Constantinople, join a caravan to Persia, and eventually reach the markets of Central Asia or even China. Few undertook such long journeys, but the possibility itself was significant. Goods no longer moved only within small regional circuits. They flowed across continents. Local economies adapted to these changes. In England, wool became a major export, feeding textile industries in Flanders and Italy. In Germany, mining boomed, producing silver and copper for European markets. In the Baltic, rye and fish supported growing populations. In Spain, olive oil and wine traveled north. Trade encouraged specialization, making different regions interdependent. It also stimulated urban growth, like cities like Bruges, Florence, Barcelona, and Cologne thrived on commerce. Yet the rhythm of medieval trade remained calm and measured, shaped by seasons, winds, and slow transportation. Caravans moved steadily but carefully across deserts. Ships waited for favorable winds before crossing the Mediterranean. Merchants traveled in groups for safety. Letters could take months to reach distant partners. Despite these constraints, the gradual reconnection of continents fostered stability. Trust between trading partners encouraged cooperation. Alliances formed around shared economic interests. Even during periods of conflict, trade often continued quietly because communities relied on one another. Trade also played a role in shaping political power. Kings granted privileges to merchant towns in exchange for taxes and military support. Town charters protected commercial rights. Ports became valuable sources of revenue. Rulers who supported trade often grew wealthier and more influential. Those who disrupted it risked instability. In this way, trade encouraged diplomacy, urban autonomy, and legal innovation. As the medieval period drew to a close, Europe stood transformed. What had once been a fractured landscape was now threaded with roots, roads, rivers, sea lanes, and caravan paths that linked it to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Trade had not only brought wealth, it had brought knowledge, stability, and connection. A continent that had retreated into localism after Rome's fall had rediscovered the wider world. And so, when we trace the quiet rebirth of trade, we see more than the movement of goods. We see the revival of communication, the spread of ideas, the growth of towns, and the rise of a new global consciousness. These roots, rebuilt step by step, carried not only spices and cloth, but the foundations of the modern world. Through patient negotiation and countless journeys, merchants stitched continents together again. One river, one ship, one caravan at a time.
In the middle of the 14th century, Europe moved to the rhythm of familiar patterns: harvests, markets, pilgrimages, fairs, feasts, and the daily labors that had shaped life for generations. Villages echoed with the sound of mills grinding grain. Ships moved steadily across the Mediterranean, and towns bustled with merchants and craftsmen. Yet beneath this sense of stability, pressures had begun to build. Growing populations, limited land, and occasional crop failures created strain. No one could imagine how swiftly the world was about to change. For in 1347, a quiet shadow slipped into the continent, one that would alter the course of history: the Black Death. The Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which could spread through fleas carried by rodents or through droplets between people in its pneumonic form. Its origins trace back to Central Asia, from where it traveled along caravan routes and maritime lanes that had become increasingly active. The disease moved silently at first. A merchant ship docked in a Mediterranean port, perhaps in Sicily, perhaps in Crimea, its crew already dying.
From these early points of entry, the plague spread rapidly, following the very networks that had reconnected the medieval world. By the spring of 1348, the plague had moved through Italy, southern France, and Spain. By summer, it reached England and the ports of the Low Countries. It marched inland through Germany, the Alps, and the Balkans. No region was immune. Villages, towns, monasteries, and cities saw populations fall with terrifying speed. Contemporary writers, struggling to understand what they witnessed, described sudden fevers, painful swellings, and death within days. Fear traveled faster than the disease. Bells tolled incessantly. Streets fell quiet. Entire households disappeared in a matter of days. Europe had never faced a disaster of this scale. The plague struck rich and poor, clerics and merchants, peasants and nobles. In some towns, half the population died. In others, even more. The loss was not evenly distributed. Some regions experienced catastrophic mortality, while others suffered less severely, but the general effect was unmistakable. Europe lost an estimated third to half of its people in a few short years. The world that emerged after the plague was fundamentally different. At first, society struggled simply to cope with the immediate crisis. Graves filled too quickly for clergy to perform traditional rites. Families lacked the strength to bury their loved ones. Governments tried to impose quarantines, though the concept was still new. Trade routes were disrupted. Fields went unharvested. Flocks wandered untended. Ships lay abandoned in ports, their crew gone. The routines that had structured medieval life collapsed. Yet, in the midst of this devastation, human resilience slowly revealed itself. Communities developed new burial practices when old ones became impossible. Travelers were isolated in ports for weeks, a practice that eventually became the quarantine system. Cities appointed officials to care for the sick, clean streets, and enforce separation between households. While these measures could not stop the spread entirely, they represented the first coordinated public health responses in European history. As the first wave of plague passed, survivors emerged into a transformed landscape. The most immediate effect was demographic. With far fewer people, labor became scarce. Before the plague, peasants had competed for access to land. Now, landowners competed for workers. Wages rose as peasants negotiated better terms. Some left the estates where their families had labored for generations, seeking opportunities elsewhere. The rigid structures of serfdom weakened. Lords who once demanded labor quotas now offered reduced rents or even freedom to attract tenants. The balance of power between landowner and peasant shifted dramatically. In this new environment, many villages saw change unfold quickly. Peasants gained mobility. They moved to towns that needed workers or to regions where abandoned fields offered fresh opportunities. Former serfs became landholders. Families that had survived inherited property from relatives who had not. In some places, entire villages were abandoned. Fields reverted to pasture. Forests reclaimed farmland, and silence replaced the sound of daily activity. Yet in other areas, new settlements emerged, built by people seeking to rebuild their lives. Towns and cities also felt the transformation. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers were suddenly in high demand. Guilds expanded membership. Urban wages rose. Some cities offered tax exemptions or land grants to attract settlers. With fewer people competing for housing, living standards improved for many survivors. Streets were replanned, buildings repaired, and markets reorganized. Economic life revived more quickly than people expected, propelled not by institutions, but by the determination of ordinary workers. The church, too, was deeply affected. Many clergy had died caring for the sick. Monasteries lost experienced monks and nuns. Parish priests were replaced quickly.
sometimes with those less trained. This created tensions as people questioned the authority and competence of new clerics. Some communities blamed the church for failing to stop the plague. Others found comfort in faith. Pilgrimages increased. New religious movements emerged, emphasizing personal piety and direct connection with the divine. The Black Death did not destroy medieval faith, but it reshaped it. Another significant consequence was intellectual. The sheer scale of loss forced people to ask new questions about life, death, God, nature, and community. Chroniclers describe the plague in detailed accounts that remain essential historical sources. Physicians struggled to understand the disease, drawing on ancient texts while also observing symptoms firsthand. Though their treatments were limited, the plague encouraged closer attention to medicine, environment, and public health. Economically, the reduced population brought unexpected benefits. With fewer mouths to feed, food prices fell. Meat became more widely consumed. Cloth and manufactured goods became more accessible. Some families achieved prosperity that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Land became cheaper. Forests provided timber for new construction. Orchards and vineyards expanded. In many regions, the decades after the plague saw improvements in diet, housing, and clothing.
Social relations also changed. With labor scarce, women entered trades that had previously excluded them. They worked as brewers, merchants, cloth makers, healers, and shopkeepers. Widows inherited businesses. Women's economic roles expanded, though formal equality remained distant. The plague had disrupted established patterns, and in the space created by loss, new forms of participation emerged. The Black Death also encouraged changes in technology. Faced with fewer workers, communities sought more efficient tools. Water mills and windmills proliferated. Iron tools improved. Agricultural techniques advanced. The adoption of new horse harnesses, deeper plows, and better crop rotations accelerated. These innovations were not caused by the plague, but gained momentum because labor shortages demanded efficiency. The long-term effect was increased productivity. Cultural expression reflected the transformation as well. Art, once focused mainly on religious themes, now included images of transience, mortality, and human vulnerability. The figure of death appeared in manuscripts, carvings, and murals. The famous Dance of Death motif reminded viewers that all, regardless of wealth or rank, were equal before the grave. Yet these somber images coexisted with a renewed appreciation for life. Music flourished in courts. Poets wrote about love, honor, and the fragility of human existence. Creativity became a way to make sense of a world forever changed. Over the following centuries, additional outbreaks of plague occurred, though never with the same severity as the initial wave. But each recurrence reinforced the transformations already underway. Serfdom continued to fade. Towns continued to grow. Trade routes adapted. Families invested in land, tools, and education. Governments introduced public health measures and taxation reforms. Europe, though shaped by tragedy, became more dynamic. These changes helped set the stage for the Renaissance. With increased wealth in towns, improved literacy, and greater access to classical texts, many preserved in monasteries, art, science, and learning flourished. Merchants funded libraries. Printers spread ideas more rapidly than ever before. Scholars revisited ancient works, seeking wisdom in Greek and Roman philosophy. Though the Renaissance had many causes, the demographic and economic shifts triggered by the Black Death provided fertile ground for intellectual rebirth. The plague's impact also reached beyond Europe. The Islamic world experienced its own devastating losses. Cities such as Cairo and Damascus saw populations plunge. Trade routes were disrupted across Asia and North Africa. Yet even here, societies adapted. Recovery varied by region, but long-distance commerce eventually resumed, carrying goods between Africa, the Middle East, India, and Europe. The Mongol Empire, already weakening, fragmented further under the strain of disease and political instability. China, too, suffered greatly, contributing to the eventual fall of the Yuan dynasty. The plague was not a European event, it was a global turning point. In reflecting on the Black Death, it is important to avoid simple narratives of decline or renewal. The plague caused immense suffering and loss, but it also revealed the resilience of human communities. People rebuilt because they had no choice, but also because they believed in the value of family, land, and faith. They worked, prayed, traded, married, planted, and dreamed in a world transformed by tragedy. Their decisions created a new trajectory for medieval society. If we look closely, we see that the Black Death did not merely destroy, it reorganized. Old hierarchies weakened, mobility increased, wealth changed hands, knowledge expanded, towns grew, trade revived, innovation accelerated. Even as sorrow marked the memories of the living, hope quietly reshaped their futures. The contrast between devastation and adaptation became one of the defining characteristics of late medieval Europe. And so, when we think of the Black Death today, we see more than a catastrophe. We see a turning point, a moment when the medieval world, shaken to its core, began to evolve. The rhythms of life changed, the structure of society shifted, and the foundations of the modern age were laid. Through silence and suffering, through resilience and renewal, a new Europe emerged from the ashes of the old.
By the late Middle Ages, Europe was a continent reshaped by centuries of quiet change. Trade routes revived, monasteries preserved learning, kingdoms formed and fractured, and communities rebuilt after the devastation of the Black Death. Yet beneath these visible shifts, another transformation was slowly unfolding. It did not begin with grand discoveries or sudden inventions. It began in whispers, in workshops, in scriptoria, in bustling markets, in cathedral schools, and in the minds of curious individuals who looked at the world and asked new questions. This subtle movement, rising between the 12th and 14th centuries, would become the foundation of what we later called the Renaissance. But in its earliest form, it was simply a dawn of new ideas, a quiet spark illuminating a continent ready for change. To understand this dawn, we must imagine medieval Europe not as a stagnant world, but as a place filled with small, steady currents of thought. For centuries, learning had been centered in monasteries, where monks copied ancient texts and preserved knowledge from Greece and Rome. These manuscripts rested on dusty shelves, mathematical treatises, philosophical works, medical guides, histories, and poetry. They were known to a few, read by fewer. But in the 12th century, something remarkable happened. The world of learning began to expand beyond monastery walls. One major catalyst came from outside Europe. Across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cordoba, scholars had translated Greek scientific and philosophical works into Arabic, studied them, expanded upon them, and preserved texts that no longer existed in Europe. Through Spain, Sicily, and the Mediterranean trade routes,
These Arabic manuscripts gradually reached European scholars. Cities like Toledo became translation centers where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked together to render Arabic texts into Latin. Suddenly, medieval Europe encountered the works of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and others, not through fragments, but in full. These translations did more than supply information. They opened windows into entirely new ways of thinking. Aristotle's logical methods encouraged scholars to question, categorize, and reason. His treatises on physics and metaphysics challenged old assumptions about nature. Mathematical works introduced new understandings of geometry and proportion. Medical texts offered insights into the human body far beyond what Europe had preserved. Astronomy manuals revealed complex models of the heavens. These ideas did not overturn medieval belief. Rather, they enriched it, offering tools to better understand creation. The establishment of universities accelerated this intellectual awakening. Institutions in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and later Prague, Salamanca, and Heidelberg attracted students from across Europe. Their curriculum was structured around the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. But within this framework, new questions emerged. Scholars debated the nature of the soul, the movement of planets, the structure of society, and the limits of human reason. Professors lectured in Latin to crowds of eager students who traveled far from home to learn. These universities became engines of thought, shaping generations of clergy, lawyers, physicians, and administrators. One of the most significant developments in this era was scholasticism, a method of learning that blended logic, faith, and inquiry. Thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, and Duns Scotus used reason to analyze theology. They did not abandon faith. Instead, they sought to understand it more deeply. Aquinas, drawing on Aristotle, argued that faith and reason were not enemies, but partners. This synthesis created a stable intellectual foundation that allowed new ideas to flourish without destabilizing religious belief. The Church remained central to learning, but the methods of learning became broader, sharper, and more analytical. Outside the universities, another quiet revolution was unfolding, the rise of written culture. As literacy increased, more people began to record observations, keep account books, write poetry, and compose letters. Paper, introduced to Europe through trade with the Islamic world, made writing more affordable. Towns began keeping archives. Merchants documented contracts. Cities preserved records of population, trade, and governance. This growth of written documentation strengthened administration and encouraged rational organization. It also laid the groundwork for later artistic and scientific innovation. Meanwhile, Europe's growing trade networks brought not only goods, but ideas. Merchants traveling between cities encountered new technologies, customs, and artistic styles. Italian and Flemish towns, growing wealthier through commerce, became cultural crossroads where painters, architects, and scholars exchanged techniques. Prosperous families funded construction projects, cathedrals, town halls, bridges that required skilled craftsmen, mathematicians, and engineers. Artisans learned from one another how to mix pigments, design arches, carve stone, weave textiles, and cast metal. These practical skills were themselves forms of knowledge, preserved through guilds and workshops. Gothic architecture, with its soaring vaults and luminous stained glass, illustrates this fusion of creativity and engineering. Cathedrals like Chartres, Reims, Cologne, and Canterbury were not only religious structures, they were symbols of collective intellect. Builders calculated weight distribution, experimented with ribbed vaults, and developed flying buttresses to support tall walls.
Architects sketched detailed plans. Masons used geometry to shape stones. Glaziers created windows that taught biblical narratives through color and light. These cathedrals embodied the era's spirit: faith expressed through innovation, tradition enriched by experimentation. The expansion of trade also brought Europeans into greater contact with the wider world. Through Mediterranean merchants, travelers learned about Chinese inventions such as gunpowder, magnetic compasses, and printing. Although these technologies entered Europe gradually and were adapted to local needs, they stirred curiosity about science and exploration. Gunpowder altered warfare. Compasses improved navigation. New ship designs increased maritime range. Europeans began to imagine horizons beyond familiar shores. The Black Death, as devastating as it was, produced unexpected cultural effects that contributed to the dawn of new ideas. With vast demographic shifts and economic changes, societies reevaluated their structures. Labor shortages encouraged innovation. Improved living standards allowed more families to support education. Survivors inherited wealth that they later invested in learning or trade. Clergy, weakened by losses, sometimes struggled to maintain authority, opening space for new spiritual and intellectual movements. While the plague was a tragedy, it indirectly created conditions for change.
In literature, a new voice began to emerge, one more personal, emotional, and human-centered. Writers such as Dante Alighieri, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Geoffrey Chaucer broke from purely religious themes. Dante's Divine Comedy blended theology with personal experience and classical learning. Boccaccio's Decameron explored human behavior with wit and realism. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales portrayed a wide range of social classes, each with distinct personalities. These works did not belong fully to the Renaissance. They belonged to the dawn before it, where writers dared to explore the human condition in new ways. Another subtle shift happened in art. Medieval painting had long been symbolic, emphasizing spiritual meaning over realism. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, artists in Italy, such as Giotto, experimented with depth, emotion, and naturalism. Faces became more expressive. Landscapes gained dimension. Buildings were drawn with a sense of space. These innovations were modest compared to later Renaissance masterpieces, but they pointed the way forward. They signaled a desire to observe the world more directly, to capture life as it appeared, not only as it was believed to be. This renewed attention to nature extended into science. Scholars began to question old explanations for natural phenomena, drawing on observation and early experimentation. Physicians studied anatomy more closely, sometimes using dissections in university settings. Astronomers compared ancient models of the heavens with their own observations, noticing inconsistencies. Mathematicians refined techniques in calculation and geometry. While medieval science remained intertwined with philosophy and theology, its methods grew more rigorous. These incremental changes prepared the ground for the scientific revolutions of later centuries. Cities played an essential role in nurturing new ideas. As populations recovered, urban life grew vibrant again. Town squares filled with musicians, storytellers, clerics, and scholars. Artisan guilds trained apprentices in specialized crafts. Libraries expanded. Schools multiplied. Wealthy families began to commission works of art, support scholars, and sponsor building projects. This patronage, though still modest, encouraged creativity. In places like Florence, Siena, and Venice, merchant culture fostered curiosity and competition. People took pride in civic achievement as much as religious devotion. Religious orders also contributed to this intellectual dawn. The Dominican and Franciscan friars, unlike monks who lived in isolated monasteries,
worked within cities. They preached, taught, and engaged with urban communities. Dominicans focused on scholarship and university teaching. Franciscans emphasized simplicity, charity, and an appreciation of nature. Together, they broadened the scope of religious life, making spiritual learning more accessible to ordinary people. Their sermons, writings, and schools helped spread new ideas across social classes. At the same time, Europe experienced political changes that encouraged broader thinking. Kings centralized authority, creating courts that attracted intellectuals, lawyers, architects, and poets. Diplomacy expanded, travel increased. Rulers exchanged letters, sent ambassadors, and engaged in debates over law, governance, and philosophy. These interactions encouraged a shared European identity built on communication and learning. Another important development was the rediscovery of Roman law. In the 12th century, scholars at Bologna began studying Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive compilation of Roman legal texts preserved in the Byzantine Empire. Its systematic approach to justice, property, and governance influenced European legal traditions. It also encouraged rational analysis, an approach that spread beyond law into philosophy, politics, and administration. By the 14th century, the quiet spark of new ideas glowed across Europe. It was not yet the full flame of the Renaissance, but the foundations were in place. Cities thrived, universities expanded, art evolved, literature flourished, trade connected distant regions, scientific curiosity grew, and beneath all these developments lay a belief that learning could illuminate life, a belief that would soon reshape the entire continent. When we look back on this dawn, we often focus on what came afterward: the brilliant art of Michelangelo, the discoveries of Copernicus, the voyages of explorers, the philosophical innovations of humanism. But the true wonder lies in the centuries before these achievements, the long, quiet preparation, the gradual accumulation of knowledge, the subtle shifts in perspective. The Renaissance did not arise suddenly. It emerged from countless small sparks, lit by individuals who preserved, translated, questioned, observed, traded, taught, and created. This was the dawn of new ideas, a dawn rooted in patience rather than speed, in curiosity rather than revolution. It was a time when Europe rediscovered ancient knowledge, embraced new influences, and opened itself to possibilities beyond the familiar. The world after this dawn would be different, more connected, more confident, more ambitious. But in these early centuries, the change was gentle, like morning light slowly revealing the landscape. And so, before the Renaissance dazzled the world, there was a quieter moment, a moment when medieval Europe began to imagine a future shaped not only by tradition, but by inquiry and creativity. In that moment, the seeds of modern thought were planted. They grew in the minds of scholars, the hands of artisans, the words of poets, and the lines of early paintings. This was not yet the age of brilliance, but the beginning of its possibility. The soft glow before sunrise, the first spark before the world changed forever.
Over roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century to the opening decades of the early modern age, Europe transformed in ways both subtle and seismic. What began as a patchwork of local loyalties and ruined cities gradually became a network of kingdoms, churches, towns, and intellectual institutions that would define the modern West. The broad sweep of this era, often called the Middle Ages, stretches from roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries, a long arc of adaptation, continuity, and reinvention. The collapse of imperial administration did not mean the end of order. It shifted where order came from. Bishops, monasteries, local lords, and emerging courts filled gaps left by Rome, preserving texts, legal practices, and administrative routines that allowed communities to function. Over generations, those local systems were refined into networks of law, custom, and allegiance that made larger polities possible again. The result was a layered society in which oral tradition and written records, pastoral care, and fiscal management all worked together to stabilize life across a fragmented landscape. Political consolidation sometimes arrived through exceptional figures and decisive moments. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 stands as a symbol of one such moment, a renewed claim, however imperfect, to unite large parts of Western Europe under a common political and cultural project. His patronage of learning and administration helped spread literacy and legal practice, pointing towards centralized governance even as many regions remained locally governed. Catastrophes accelerated change as well. The mid-14th century Black Death killed a vast fraction of the population, breaking demographic and economic patterns and forcing societies to renegotiate labor, land, and authority. The demographic shock weakened some old hierarchies, boosted wages and mobility for many laborers, and indirectly encouraged innovations in agriculture, public health, and urban life, shifts that echo into later centuries. Alongside disruption, cultural and institutional renewal matured. Monasteries and cathedral schools seeded universities. Merchants rebuilt long-distance commerce. Artisans and guilds refined techniques. And legal traditions, such as those embodied by the Magna Carta, 1215, slowly reconfigured expectations about authority and rights. These changes produced durable institutions that could support larger states and more complex economies. Finally, technological and communicative shifts helped close the millennium with a different world in view. The spread of movable type printing in the 15th century made books cheaper and ideas more mobile, accelerating literacy, standardizing knowledge, and empowering new intellectual movements that would flower in the Renaissance and Reformation. The cumulative effect of these political, social, and technological trends is the real legacy of the medieval millennium, foundations laid quietly over centuries that made the modern world possible. In short, the 1,000 years after Rome did not simply bridge antiquity and modernity, they transformed them both. Through preservation and loss, continuity and invention, Europe learned to knit together local lives into continental systems, legal, economic, spiritual, and intellectual, whose influence still shapes our institutions, our maps, and many of the assumptions we carry about law, learning, and community. That slow remaking is the true story of a millennium that reshaped the world.